Greetings to all my viewers. As I mentioned to you day before yesterday, in initiating this series of talks on books that matter to me and to many others, I want to begin with a book by Ashis Nandy called The Intimate Enemy: Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialism. This is the first paperback edition. The book was published almost 40 years ago in 1983. And there's a more recent edition with an additional new preface, also published by Nandi's principal publisher, Oxford University Press. So this is the more recent edition of the book. Now, before I launch into sharing my thoughts on this book, I want to mention a couple of things. That in the preceding introduction to the series, I had made some remarks about books and books that have been important for me, um, with some marginal notes on the practices of reading. So, in this series of book talks, I also expect to actually have a number of talks which will simply be really about the practices and cultures of reading. Why is it, for example, that some authors have thought that reading in bed is far more productive, far more intellectually interesting than reading on an armchair? And there are others who, of course, take completely the contrary view. But there are many other kinds of questions when it comes to cultures of book and practices of reading. And in sharing some of those insights, I'm also going to sort of recall some incidents from my childhood and how I got interested in books. And in doing so, I might also take up stories that I know about others, how other authors have described books. So we will also be discussing books which are really about books. We will also be discussing at considerable length, I hope, a very fundamental question, a question that was raised by, among many others, George Steiner, a really well known literary critic who's perhaps not read very much these days. He's not really someone who's in fashion these days, if I may put it this way. But George Steiner made the observation that you read a novel by, let's say, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, and when a character that you've seen developing over a period of time suddenly passes away, you feel enormous sadness. Sometimes you might start crying. And so the question he raises in one of his essays, Steiner, is how is it that literature can produce these kinds of reactions, and yet your neighbor next door might die and you might feel nothing, right? So why is it that fiction sometimes moves us a lot more than the suffering of people in the real world, as people call it, right? So what are the effects that literature produces? So these are, I think, some of the kinds of things that we have to also think about when we think about books. But let me go straight into Ashish Nandy's book with this caveat, and this caveat really applies to all the talks that I will be delivering here, or all my sort of informal kind of ruminations on the books that have interested me or that interest me and for very particular reasons. And that caveat is that these talks are not really prepared talks. I'm sort of thinking more or less as I am actually speaking. I have, in some cases, notes for books because some of these books are works that I have taught. The vast majority of them, if indeed this series continues, and who knows, uh, I might lose steam within 2 weeks. But if this series continues, there will obviously be books, and the vast majority of them will be books that are books that I have not taught. There are only really a few number that I have taught among the ones that I really wish to discuss. Um, so with this caveat in mind, and I also want to add the consideration that some of these books, well, in fact, actually, I think perhaps one could say, nearly every book. I mean, barring a work of fiction which one might read in a different kind of way, or a work of poetry, that works of history, anthropology, philosophy, sociology, literary criticism, there isn't a book I've read that I don't have some kind of critical perspective on. I might not always share that critical perspective because in a brief talk, I might really want to adumbrate, as I would want to do in uh, the case of Nandi's book today. I might really want to adumbrate what I consider to be its very specific characteristics and the kinds of contributions it makes to intellectual culture. So this book was published in 1983. Now, many of you will want to know who is Ashis Nandy. And here I bring in another set of considerations, almost by way of a caveat once again, which is maybe we should pause and ask ourselves, why do we really want to know so much about the author? I think most readers want to know. I mean, typically when I teach, I mean, a student will say, well, where's the author from? Right? What's their background? What university did they go to? Um, where were they born? Where were they raised? Where do they make their living? How do they make their living? Right? What awards have they won? You know, have they won the Nobel Prize or the Pulitzer Prize or the National Book Award? Right? Or have they won, you know, the greatest award given in Germany or India or France? Right? Have they won the Sahitya Academy Award in India, which is given for the best work in Marathi, in Gujarati, in Bengali, and even in English and Hindi, you know, in 15, 20 languages? People want to know that. Now, I think that sometimes we should restrain the impulse to know. So the young T S Eliot wrote an essay. Uh, I don't remember exactly how old he was when he wrote that essay, but I think he was in his early 20s. And it's astonishing, it's really astonishing how much good stuff he wrote at a very young age, including, of course, that extraordinary poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. I think when I said extraordinary, most of you would have immediately, if you're familiar with T.S. Eliot, thought to yourselves, I'm going to say The Wasteland. And yes, of course, that's an extraordinary poem as well, right? But I think Eliot was maybe about 19 or 20 when he wrote The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And similarly, he wrote a great many essays. Right? So he's actually equally renowned, at least among scholars, for his literary criticism, not just for the four quartets and for his poetry and the plays, which is what won him international recognition, including the Nobel Prize for Literature, but rather it is also the literary essays, which I think signified uh, the kind of intellect that he brought to his work, including, in fact, actually his poetry. So, one of the things he says in this essays is that the more that in this particular essay, tradition and the individual talent, the more that the author brings of himself or herself into the work, the lesser the work it is. Right? Now, you may not wish to accept that, which is perfectly fine. But nonetheless, what I'm suggesting to you is that this autobiographical and now biographical element is something that the modern reader is always very keen on trying to discern. And I think one reason for that is that the question of identity, particularly in some cultures, has become a paramount question. I think it's become so paramount that it has actually prevented us from thinking constructively about a great many other questions and in formulating questions, I think, in a somewhat more intelligent fashion than if we are doing so now, given the kind of obsession that many people really have with the question of identity. Right? And think of it this way: that when you pick up an 18th century text, and here let me clarify, an 18th century text in the original edition, right? And not a reprint, let's say a work by Kant or Hegel. So if you pick up a work by Kant or by Hegel from the 19th century, uh, or any work, what do you find? So you find typically you'll find a biographical note, right? Well, in the 18th century, if you look at an 18th century edition of a work or a 19th century edition of a work, there were never any biographical notes. Well, one reason for that, of course, is that books typically did not have dust jackets. And once you have dust jackets, then you have a blurb. So you have a blurb, you have a description of the book, right? Which makes the reader lazy sometimes because the blurb does the work for you. And then, of course, many people by blurb understand an endorsement by another writer. So one of the ways in which people attempt to sell their books is to get blurbs or endorsements from other writers. I think, if I may say so, that some people are actually in the business of writing blurbs. I won't mention names, but they are very famous writers and some not so famous writers whose blurbs I've seen on probably 50 books, right? I think that, well, if they've actually read all those 50 books, I doubt very much that they've had time to write any of their own books. But leave that aside. So we have these endorsements. We have a biographical note, and we have a description of the book, which will be on the dust jacket of the book. And of course, if it's a paperback, as is the case of this book, right? So here is the back of that. So you see a photograph of the author, right? So you see what's happening, that uh, the reader is already being led along the way, right? Into thinking about not so much really even the book, into thinking about who wrote the book. And therefore, can I make certain inferences about how this author's background colors the arguments? Right? So one of the things I'm going to actually suggest is that I think every now and then try to see if you can restrain yourself from the temptation of finding out about the author, beyond perhaps a few very elementary things. But it's not even clear that we really need that. So I'm not, so apropos of everything that I've said, therefore, I'm not going to say anything about who Ashis Nandy is. What I'm going to share with you are some of my thoughts. So this work, in my view, is perhaps one of the most extraordinary works of the 20th century. Its original preface of something like 13, 14 pages packs a punch that thousands of books on colonialism, entire books, don't. It's extraordinarily well written and thoughtful. And I was dazzled when I read this book to read at the end of the preface uh, Ashis Nandy saying that he is someone who has only acquired reasonable competence in the English language, because he says that this is not my native tongue, right? And he says that some people have suggested to me that I was taught the wrong English by my forefathers and I must relearn the language. Frankly, I am too old to do so, he says. Those who are offended by my language may console themselves by remembering that the language in which I think has traditionally looked at the male and the female differently. Now, that also gives us one insight into what this book is about. So here's a first observation really about the subject matter of the book, which is that, as the subtitle indicates, loss and recovery of self under colonialism, this book is really about how India was colonized. Right? But we could put in the place of India, we could put almost any other country that has been colonized. And we could also put in the place of India, with, of course, some qualifications. The material will be different. Some of the material circumstances are doubtless different, right? But we could also put in the place of an entire country, we could put the Irish, the loss and recovery of self for the Irish under colonialism. Because let us not forget that before the English colonized Indians and then the Africans, they colonized the Irish. the Scots, the Welsh, their own women. In fact, they didn't just colonize the Irish, they brutalized them. Brutalized them. There's no question about that. And there are a great many English writings on India from the 18th century onwards, where you can see that the disdain that is expressed for the Indians is sometimes less than the disdain that was expressed by the English for the Irish, who were, of course, popish, right? That is, they were slavish devotees of the Pope, they were Catholics. And one of the things that I think we always have to be attentive about, this is partially in a way, although he doesn't really put it in those terms. Um, and I'm referring to Edward Said's book, Orientalism, on which I'll have a separate talk in the weeks or months ahead. But we have to keep in mind that when we're looking at the 18th century and the 19th century, and we're looking at European scholarship on India or some other part of the world, very often, really, the subject matter appears to be India, but really the book is really about something else, right? So there are undercurrents of anti-Semitism, for example, which are critically important in many of these writings. They may not be at all obvious to most readers, but they're there, right? So what then is the first thing that we can say about the intimate enemy, right? The first thing is very simply this, that if you look at the traditional books, traditional scholarship on colonialism, colonialism was taken to be principally an economic, military, and political enterprise. So it entailed the economic exploitation of the colony, uh, the military conquest, and of course, the installation of a new political regime, that is the regime of the colonizer. Now, this is not what Nandi is principally concerned with. This is really only the backdrop, right? Because what he's fundamentally interested in is, to put it simply, and this is in fact the subject of the first of the two essays. There are only two essays. The book is 110 odd pages, plus another 15 pages of the preface, right? So 125 pages. It was originally a very long manuscript. Mr. Nandi told me many, many years ago when I first met him in 1986 or thereabouts, that the original manuscript was about 3 times as long. And, then on the advice of a couple of friends, he was advised to see if he could pare it down to about a third of its size, a third or fourth of its size, which he did so. Right? And he thinks it became a better book precisely because of that kind of brutal editorial intervention. Right? So I asked him then, I said, where's the original manuscript? And he said, I don't have it. He said, some friend borrowed it 40 years ago. There was only one copy, the original typescript, and that friend never returned it. And then over the years, Nandi even forgot who had borrowed it. Right? Well, that's the nature of the man. He's not possessive about his knowledge. I don't think one should be. But there are very few who have that extraordinary spirit of generosity about knowledge that Ashis Nandy does. Right? And that's also partly what the book is about. Right? It's about how does one actually become generous with the knowledge that one has. So, what is then the title of that one essay, which is really the subject matter of this book? It's the psychology of colonialism, because it is Nandi's submission that there is no colonization which is as profound as the psychological colonization. Long after the colonizers have left the shore of the colony, people can continue to remain to be colonized. I think what is transpiring in India today is a palpable demonstration of this. Nowhere more so than among the advocates of militant Hinduism, who think, in fact, that they are actually being original, who think that they are really weeding out, right, Mekale's children, that's, which is how they refer to the anglicized elite. But in fact, it is these very people who are so profoundly colonized that it would be almost impossible to begin to unravel the degree to which they're really colonized, right? Their whole notion of the nation state, their whole notion of nationalism, their understanding of Hinduism, their understanding of, what constitutes masculinity, what constitutes femininity. So this is really the subject matter of the book. How does one think about such things as masculinity and femininity during the period of colonialism? Right? And one of the central figures who features in this book, I wouldn't say he completely dominates the book, because the book really does have a discussion of a number of people. It has a discussion of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the 19th century novelist, most well known for the novel Anandomoth. It has a discussion of Kipling. It has a discussion of Sri Aurobindo, right? And some other people as well. But the person who really occupies center stage in this book is Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. And what Nandi is going to argue is that virtually all of our nationalists were colonized, barring Mohandas Gandhi. Now, it's not so much that this is an argument he makes explicitly, or that this is really even the argument that stands out. This is one of the things that one can certainly take away from the book, because there are a great many other arguments that are tied to this. Right? So, for example, the argument that colonialism is not possible unless there is some kind of pact between the colonizer and the colonized. There is some codes that are going to be shared between the two. And this is the question that Gandhi himself brought up in Hind Swaraj, because one of the questions that he posed in Hind Swaraj in 1909 was, how is it that we as a people became colonized? The same question that Bankim Chandra Chatterjee posed in the late 19th century. Right? How did we as a people become colonized? And one of the answers that Gandhi is going to give is that, well, we were seduced by the glitter of the material civilization of the West. Right? We thought that this civilization, as the colonizers were telling us Indians, we thought that this civilization indeed was, at this juncture in history, a superior civilization. But now, to get really the flavor of Nandi's book, let's just look just at a few passages. Because when I submitted that the subject matter of the book is a psychology of colonialism, right, which is the title of the first of the two essays, now I think, at least for a somewhat sophisticated reader, this insight is perhaps not very novel. That is, that people understand, people who have reflected on these matters understand that, well, yes, in some ways we can remain colonized, much as, for example, it can take generations for a group of people who have been oppressed and who have been liberated by the rule of law. Right? So African Americans in the United States, Dalits in India, have constitutional rights. They certainly have constitutional rights. But do these people feel emancipated? And here I'm not speaking about the question of whether these constitutional rights actually work on the ground. What I'm speaking is that it can take generations for a group of people to really free themselves of the yoke of this form of colonialism, right? And that's what Nandi is referring to as a psychology of colonialism. But notice how he puts it in a very different way. in the very first few lines of the preface. And that alerts you to the fact that what you're really speaking about in this book is a completely different register of thoughts, right? So he says modern colonialism won its great victories not so much through its military and technological prowess as through its ability to create secular hierarchies incompatible with the traditional order. And it's a very different formulation than what people understand when they think about the psychology of colonialism. It won its greatest victories by its ability, the West, to create secular hierarchies incompatible with the traditional order. Now, a critical reader will immediately pick up on this and say, well, I have a probing question here. This sounds as though there may be a defense forthcoming of something called tradition. And if indeed the reader felt that way, particularly if, let's say, they knew the works of Nandi, that reader may in fact not be inaccurate. But then, of course, we'll have to see whether Nandi is offering some defense of tradition or whether in fact he is speaking about, to use his own language from a different work, he's speaking about a kind of a critical traditionalism. Because he does say at the very end of the book that he is in no manner attempting to create a neo-romantic ideology of the irrational, the mythic, or the reactionary. So now, if you tie this in with the very first few lines, this is the last few lines almost of the book, right? When he's speaking about these secular hierarchies that were created by the West, which were incompatible with the traditional order, what he's talking about is elevating the rational over the irrational, elevating masculinity over femininity, history over ahistoricity or myth, the adult over the child. These are secular hierarchies because in the pre-modern world, in many, and not just in India, in many parts of the world, there was a different way of thinking about the relationship, for example, between masculinity and femininity. So I want to elaborate only on that point, and because in this introductory talk on this book, I spent the first half of it speaking about other matters by ways of caveat and so on, I will follow this up with another short talk on this book, but thereafter, I think I'm going to restrict myself to only one single talk for each book. But we have only begun to get into this book. But let me share my thoughts so that the listener can also start ruminating about this before I come back in a couple of days with the second half of my exploration of this book. So one of the principal arguments that Nandi is adverting to here is that with the coming of colonialism, the sexual ordering of Indian society radically altered. Right? So in the West, the supposition was that masculinity is always greater than femininity. Right? And here he's well aware of the fact that the Western tradition is by no means monolithic. He's also well aware of the fact that when we speak of Europe, we generally have in mind something called Western Europe, not Eastern Europe. So the millions of bland generalizations one hears about Europe, it generally is a reference to Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Holland, maybe the Scandinavian countries, but it's not a reference to the Slavs, right? To Slavic populations. It's not really a reference to Poland, Hungary, what is otherwise called Eastern Europe. And that's another extraordinary set of questions, and I'll do a book talk on that because there's a brilliant book by Larry Wolff called Inventing Eastern Europe, where he shows that the greatest Enlightenment thinkers of the West, that is Western Europe, had in fact nothing but contempt, absolute contempt for the people of Eastern Europe. I mean, the manner in which people like Voltaire and Diderot, who are held up as great paragons of learning and wisdom and all of that, these people were profoundly anti-democratic in many ways. And we don't have to look at what they wrote about India or Africa or Polynesia. We only have to look at what they wrote about Slavs, the Slavic populations, and they considered virtually all of Eastern Europe to be Slavic, right? So now Nandi is well aware, okay, of the fact that, well, there are different Wests and there are different Europes and all of that. But nevertheless, I mean, when he's making an argument about the West, he's talking about the major colonial powers, and in this case, Britain, who did come from Western Europe. And of course, I mean, it was principally, if you look at the history of colonialism, so if you look at the 15th century, what is the 15th century, right? It really belongs to Portugal. The 16th century belongs to Spain. The 17th century belongs to Holland. The 18th to France. The 19th to the United Kingdom. And the 20th to the Americans. Now, that doesn't mean that, well, in the 17th century, the British and the French weren't trying to make inroads. Of course they were, but Holland was, comparatively speaking, the predominant power. The 18th century, the French were more important. The 19th century really belongs to Britain. Right? So, broad generalizations. If somebody wants to quibble, let them. So when he's speaking really about the West here, I think now it should be very clear what he's referring to. And so going back to this question of masculinity and femininity and sexuality, what he's saying is that in the West, there was this conception that masculine is superior to the feminine, and both of them are superior to the idea of androgyny. Both of them are superior to the idea of androgyny. The idea that you could be, so for example, in Hinduism, one of the forms in which Shiva appears is Ardh Nari Ishvara, right? Ardh, half Nari, woman, Ishvara, God. God as half woman, half man. And there are a number of images where the one half of the body is female, right? So long hair, full breast, right? Feminine contours and curves of the body, as it were, and then the other half, short hair, flat-chested, etc. Half male, half female. And he suggests that one of the most profound consequences of colonialism was the manner in which the sexual ordering of Indian society changed, because he suggests that there were two or three different ways, principally two different ways in which people thought of masculinity and femininity in India. And one of those ways was where femininity, in fact, is superior to masculinity. And of course, we have to do the Purva Paksh. Purva Paksh is that you have to anticipate the criticism, because you can imagine here the liberals will jump up, with rage and say, oh, women were always oppressed in India. Well, how can anyone say that femininity was prized over masculinity? Well, we have to understand the different registers in which these arguments are being made, right? So, for example, the idea of Shakti was exceedingly important. Idea of female energy. And of course, Eastern India is a region of India which is largely dominated by the Shakto traditions, What he's saying is that was one ordering. Femininity is superior to masculinity. And the other ordering is androgyny is superior to both femininity and masculinity. And one of the arguments that Nandi will then put forward is to show how political dominance was homologous. That is, that there is a kind of an isomorphic compatibility, if I may put it this way, political dominance, sexual dominance, military dominance, right? So just as the British came to dominate us, in the new ordering of sexuality, the idea of the male became dominant over the female. And the idea of androgyny, which he suggests had far more wider acceptance in India than it did in the cultures of the West, this idea of androgyny was also greatly diminished as a consequence of colonial rule. And the one person, of course, who sought to embody androgyny in some fashion in his life, in his political thought, in the mode of his being in this world, was, of course, Mohandas Gandhi. Let us not forget, and I'll end with this observation, let us not forget that when Nathuram Godse offered a defense for why he had assassinated Mohandas Gandhi, one of the principal things he said was, I couldn't tolerate the idea of this womanly person being the father of the nation. He's a eunuch, Nathuram said. Nathuram Godse said, that's what he said of Gandhi. It wasn't simply that Gandhi, the reason why he assassinated him wasn't simply because, oh, Gandhi, favored the Muslims, or was the real author, as some people like to believe, the number of trolls on the internet who are going around saying this, was really the author of the idea of partition. And of course, the more abusive ones describe Gandhi as the father of Pakistan, right? These trolls, you see, are picking up on the kind of thing that Nathuram Godse was saying. Because what Godse said there was, Gandhi was effeminate, he was womanly. No strong nation state can have at the helm of its leadership a person like Gandhi. Right? And he said, that's why I had to assassinate him, not just because he was, favoring the Muslims and all of that. So you can see why the argument about masculinity, femininity, and sexuality, androgyny, all of these are actually critically important in understanding what colonialism wrought in India. But we'll discuss this a little bit more in a couple of days. Bye-bye.